under the bright lights of Atlanta International Airport. The air buzzed with the quiet chaos of travelers rushing to destinations unknown. Among them stood Margaret Whitmore, a woman in her mid-40s dressed in a tailored ivory suit that screamed authority. Her blonde hair was perfectly pinned, her pearl earrings gleamed, and her expression carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. She tapped her phone impatiently, sighing each time the boarding gate beeped for someone else. Just behind her stood Marcus King, a tall black man with a calm presence. His clothes were simple, a navy sweater, neat slacks, and scuffed shoes, but there was a quiet grace about him, the kind that didn't need attention to command respect. In one hand, he carried a worn leather briefcase, and in the other, a boarding pass for seat 3A, first class. He looked tired but composed, as if he'd seen enough of the world to know patience was its own power. When the announcement came, now boarding first-class passengers, Margaret moved forward, shoulders back, confidence overflowing. Marcus followed behind, politely keeping his distance. As she stepped onto the plane, Margaret scanned the first-class seats and saw one by the window, 3A, without hesitation. She slid her carry-on into the overhead compartment and sank into the plush leather seat with a satisfied sigh. Moments later, Marcus approached quietly, glancing at his ticket and then at her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said with gentle courtesy. "I believe this is my seat, 3A." Margaret didn't even look up from her phone. "I don't think so," she said coldly. "I've been assigned this seat." The flight attendant, a young woman named Claire, stepped in with her usual professional smile. "Let me check for you both." She took their boarding passes, glanced at the computer screen, and confirmed softly, "Actually, ma'am, seat 3 is assigned to Mr. King." Margaret's lips tightened. "That can't be right," she said sharply. "There must be some mistake. Maybe his ticket is for business class or coach." Her voice had a sweetness that was more venom than sugar. Marcus didn't respond. His calm eyes met hers for a moment, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet disappointment. Claire, feeling the tension, offered Margaret a polite smile. "Ma'am, the seat belongs to him. May I help you find yours?" But Margaret wasn't moving. She gave Marcus a once-over, her gaze deliberate and dismissive. "I'm sure he's confused," she said. "You people tend to misunderstand things." The words hit like a slap, and for a brief second, the air seemed to stop. A few passengers turned their heads. Marcus exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. Years of experience told him not to react, not to give her what she was looking for. He'd dealt with worse. Doors closed in his face, voices raised in boardrooms, assumptions made before introductions. Claire's voice trembled slightly as she spoke again. "Ma'am, please, we can't delay boarding." Margaret cut her off. "I'm not moving. If you want a seat, I'm sure there's room in the back." Claire's professional mask cracked with discomfort. She turned to Marcus, her eyes apologetic. "Sir, I'm so sorry for this. We can offer you another seat for now until we sort this out." Marcus looked at her, then back at Margaret, who had already put her headphones on as if the matter was settled. He gave a small, understanding nod. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'll take the other seat." He followed Claire toward the back of the first-class section, past the curious stares of passengers pretending not to watch. Inside, something heavy pressed against his chest. Not anger, not shock, just a dull ache of familiarity. He'd built an empire, faced obstacles that would have broken others, and still, here he was, reduced to a stereotype by a stranger too blind to see his worth. As he sat down in his temporary seat, he looked out the window at the tarmac glowing in the afternoon sun. A father helped his little daughter wave goodbye through the glass. A woman hugged her partner with tears in her eyes. The world outside moved with love and chaos, and Marcus realized how small prejudice looked compared to the vastness of life. He thought of his grandmother, Evelyn King, the woman who raised him in a 2-room house with more faith than furniture. Her voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if she were sitting beside him. "Don't let them define who you are, Marcus. When they close doors, build your own house. When they doubt you, let success be your answer." That voice had carried him through nights of struggle, rejection, and sleepless work. It was that voice that helped him start sky-high airlines with nothing but a dream and a loan no one believed he'd repay. He had built something that would outlive every insult. The plane filled with murmurs. Some passengers whispered, glancing between Margaret and Marcus. A man in a gray suit leaned toward another and muttered, "That's not right." But no one spoke up loud enough to matter. That silence, the comfortable silence of bystanders, hurt more than her words. The engines roared to life, and Marcus closed his eyes. He didn't need to prove himself that day. Truth always revealed itself in time. Still, somewhere deep inside, a sadness lingered, not for himself, but for how easy it still was to judge someone by their skin before knowing their story. Margaret, meanwhile, reclined in her stolen seat, a smug satisfaction washing over her. She ordered champagne before takeoff, her laughter ringing through the cabin as if she had earned the world's comfort. But fate, as it always does, was already setting its stage. For Marcus King, the man she had dismissed as one of those people, wasn't just another passenger. He was the reason the plane existed. The company, the aircraft, the logo printed on every napkin and uniform, it all bore his name. And soon, every person on that flight, including the woman in seat 3A, would know exactly who Marcus King really was. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane sliced through a blanket of silver clouds. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered off, and the passengers began to settle into their quiet routines, some adjusting their seats, others scrolling through their phones or reading magazines. But for Marcus, sitting 3 rows behind where he was meant to be, peace was far away. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the sting of what had just happened. The embarrassment didn't come from losing the seat. It came from the looks, the sideways glances, the whispers that weren't loud but sharp enough to slice through the air. Every pair of eyes had seen the exchange between him and the woman in 3A, but had chosen to remain silent. Marcus wasn't new to moments like these. Growing up in the Deep South, he had learned early that respect wasn't always given, even when it was earned. His mother used to say, "Sometimes you'll walk into a room full of people who only see your skin, not your story. Walk taller, anyway." And he always did. He had learned to let ignorance slide off his back, not because it didn't hurt, but because carrying anger was a weight he couldn't afford. The flight attendant, Claire, stopped by with a nervous smile. She held out a glass of water and said softly, "Sir, I'm really sorry for earlier. That shouldn't have happened." Marcus smiled back, his eyes warm. "You did your job," he said kindly. "Don't apologize for someone else's blindness." Her eyes flickered with gratitude, and she nodded. "If there's anything I can do to make you more comfortable, please let me know." He thanked her and took a slow sip of water. The cold liquid burned a little against the tightness in his throat. Kindness, genuine kindness, always touched him more deeply than cruelty ever could. Up front, Margaret was enjoying her drink, laughing softly with another passenger, her arrogance wrapped around her like perfume. She didn't glance back once. She had already decided Marcus didn't matter, that he was just another name she'd forget the moment she stepped off the plane. Marcus turned his gaze toward the window. Below them, the world looked peaceful, rivers like veins of silver, mountains like sleeping giants. The higher he flew, the smaller the chaos below seemed. Yet, no matter how high he climbed in life, there were still people eager to drag him down with assumptions. He thought back to the first time he'd ever been humiliated in public. He was only 12, carrying his school books on a crowded bus when a woman had refused to let him sit beside her. She'd placed her handbag on the seat, pretending not to notice him standing there. He'd smiled then, too, because his mother was watching from outside the bus window, and he didn't want her to see him cry. That same restraint lived in him even now, years later, thousands of feet in the air. As the flight continued, Marcus opened his laptop. He began to type, not business emails or reports, but thoughts, words he often poured into private notes. He wrote about the encounter, not naming names, but capturing the feeling, the hurt, the quiet sadness of realizing how easily people judge what they don't understand. A young white boy sitting beside his mother across the aisle leaned toward him, curious. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said shyly. "Are you a writer?" Marcus chuckled softly. "Not quite. I just like to write things that help me think. The boy smiled, his curiosity glowing. My mom says writing helps you be kind to people because you understand them better. Marcus's heart softened. Your mom's a wise woman. He paused. Always remember that. The world needs more kindness than cleverness. The boy nodded seriously before turning back to his coloring book. His mother gave Marcus an apologetic look, but he only smiled in reassurance. That small moment, a child's innocence and openness, was enough to remind him why he chose compassion over bitterness. Up in first class, Claire approached Margaret again, quietly explaining that the seat belonged to Mr. King. Margaret frowned, but waved her hand dismissively. Well, he's fine where he is. I'm sure he's more comfortable back there anyway. Her words dripped with entitlement. Claire bit back her frustration and walked away. Some lessons, she knew, life had to teach the hard way. Marcus continued typing. His message wasn't for revenge. It was a reflection, a quiet prayer that one day the world would look at people not through color, but through character. His fingers hesitated for a moment before typing a single line that would later echo across millions of hearts. Dignity is silent strength. You don't have to shout to be powerful. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane began cruising over the ocean. The cabin lights dimmed slightly and a calm filled the air. Marcus leaned back, his thoughts drifting to his past. He remembered how, years ago, investors had laughed at his idea for an airline company. They said, "A black man owning an airline? Be realistic." But he didn't fight them with words. He fought with results. He worked night after night, sacrificing comfort for purpose, building his company one flight at a time. He didn't want revenge on those who doubted him. He wanted to prove that humility and excellence could rise above hatred. He sighed softly. "Grandma," he whispered under his breath, "I hope you're proud of me." In his mind, he could hear her voice, the warmth of her faith wrapping around him. Pride isn't in proving them wrong, baby. It's in showing them what love looks like when they don't deserve it. That voice gave him strength. He looked toward the aisle, where Claire was serving drinks, her face still shadowed with guilt for how things had started. When she reached him, he smiled and said, "You're doing a great job. Don't let one bad moment define your day." Her eyes brightened. "Thank you, sir. I needed that." "You're welcome," Marcus said gently. "We all need grace sometimes." The kindness in his tone disarmed her. She had served countless passengers, but very few had spoken to her that way, with patience and sincerity. She realized then that the man she'd seen humiliated earlier had more grace in him than most of the people she served in first class. Minutes turned into hours. The clouds glowed orange with the dying sun, and the cabin filled with a golden light that made everything look softer, gentler. Margaret pressed her call button impatiently, asking for another drink, her words slurred now from too much wine. "Tell your boss he needs better service," she said, unaware that the boss she mocked was sitting just a few rows behind her. Marcus smiled faintly, overhearing her words but saying nothing. Sometimes silence is the loudest response. He closed his laptop, leaned back, and let his mind rest. He didn't need the validation of strangers. He had built something that spoke louder than any insult. Still, deep down, he wished for a world where a man's worth wasn't measured by his skin, but by his spirit. As the sun dipped below the clouds, painting the horizon in shades of fire and gold, Marcus looked out and whispered, "Maybe one day." That small whisper carried a hope larger than the plane itself, a hope that kindness, quiet and steady, would one day drown out hate. Takes a single act of ignorance to reveal a lifetime of strength. And Marcus King's strength was about to shine brighter than ever before. What Marcus didn't know was that this very flight, this painful encounter, was about to become a turning point, not just for him and Margaret, but for everyone watching. Because sometimes, if the sun had now vanished below the clouds, leaving behind a horizon streaked in fading gold, the plane's cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, wrapping the passengers in a cocoon of quiet warmth. The journey had stretched into calm monotony. Keyboard clicks, low whispers, and the rhythmic hum of jet engines filling the silence. Yet, beneath that calm surface, fate was carefully threading its invisible needle, weaving together the moment that would change everything. Marcus sat still, his gaze fixed on the faint reflection of his face in the window. The world outside looked endless, yet his mind was heavy with the weight of a world far smaller, a world that still divided worth by color and status. He wasn't angry anymore. He had long outgrown anger. What he felt now was something deeper, something quieter, a sorrow that came from knowing how blind the world could be. Up front, Margaret adjusted her pearl necklace and ordered another drink, her tone sharp, her laughter hollow. She chatted animatedly with a businessman beside her, complaining about unprofessional staff and poor seat arrangements. Every few minutes, she gestured slightly toward the back, making subtle references to Marcus as that man who tried to take my seat. The businessman nodded absently, not really listening, but she didn't care. Her voice carried just enough to be heard by those nearby, and that gave her a sense of power. But life, as it often does, was preparing to humble her. Halfway through the flight, a soft chime echoed through the cabin. The seatbelt sign blinked on as light turbulence shook the plane gently. A few gasps, some nervous laughter, then calm. The pilot's voice came through the speakers, smooth and reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be encountering mild turbulence for a few minutes. Please remain seated with your belts fastened. Margaret sighed, irritated. They really need to learn how to fly these things properly, she muttered, rolling her eyes. Marcus, a few rows behind, smiled faintly at the irony. He had personally hired that pilot years ago, an ex-Air Force officer, one of the best in the business. A few minutes later, the turbulence passed. The cabin steadied, and people began to relax again. Then came another announcement, this time not from the pilot, but from a young flight attendant's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to thank one of our very special passengers flying with us today. It's not every day we have the privilege of carrying our company's founder and CEO on board. Please join us in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Marcus King. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Every whisper, every breath, every rustle stopped. Then, all at once, heads turned. The businessman beside Margaret froze mid-sentence. The mother with the child across the aisle gasped softly. Claire, the flight attendant who had felt guilty all flight long, smiled with visible pride as she walked toward Marcus's row. Margaret blinked, her hand gripping her champagne glass. What did she say? She whispered to the man beside her. He looked pale, his eyes wide. She said Marcus King, the CEO of Sky High Airlines. That's him. Marcus stood up slowly, calm and poised, every movement deliberate yet effortless. His presence filled the space without needing grandeur. He smiled kindly at the passengers who were now staring at him with newfound awe. Claire approached him, her eyes soft with respect, and said, Mr. King, would you like to say a few words to the passengers? Marcus nodded, his deep voice steady. Of course. As he walked toward the front of the cabin, the world seemed to hold its breath. The same aisle had walked down quietly hours ago, ignored, misjudged, underestimated, now felt different. Eyes followed him, but not with dismissal this time, with respect. He reached the first-class section, standing just a few feet from Margaret. She sat frozen, her face pale, the color drained from her cheeks. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her napkin. Marcus turned to face the passengers, his expression gentle, humble. Good evening, everyone, he began. I didn't plan to speak today, but since I'm here, I want to share something small. His voice carried warmth that spread through the air like light. You see, when I started this airline, I had a simple dream. I wanted to create a space where people, no matter who they are, what they look like, or where they come from, could feel respected. I wanted people to know they belong. He paused, his gaze steady, calm. But sometimes, even when we build a world like that, prejudice still finds its way on board. And that's okay, because every time it happens, it's another chance for us to learn, to see each other better. Margaret's throat tightened. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Her mind replayed every word she had said, every sneer, every assumption. And now, here he was, the man she belittled, standing not as her victim but as her teacher. Marcus smiled faintly, glancing in her direction, not in anger but with a softness that made her shame burn deeper. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the person you underestimate is the one who's been quietly building the world you're standing in." The cabin erupted in quiet applause, the kind that starts slowly but grows sincere. The flight attendants clapped softly, their eyes glistening. Even the pilot's voice broke through again, a little unsteady with emotion. "It's an honor, sir," he said through the intercom. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his. The realization crushed her pride like fragile glass. For the first time in her life, she saw herself clearly, not the woman she imagined, but the one she had become. Arrogant, blind, small. Marcus turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled kindly. "Ma'am," he said softly, "thank you for keeping my seat warm." A ripple of laughter, gentle, forgiving, spread through the cabin. Even Margaret managed a tearful, embarrassed smile. I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I didn't know." He shook his head slowly. "That's the thing," he replied. "We should have to know someone's title to treat them with respect." Her lips trembled, her eyes lowering. "You're right," she whispered. Marcus nodded and turned to the crew. "If it's all right with you," he said, "I'll stay right where I am. This seat's been good to me." The humility in that choice stunned everyone. He had every right to take his seat back, to embarrass her, to prove a point. But he didn't. Instead, he taught them something no speech or punishment ever could, that dignity was louder than revenge and kindness heavier than pride. As he walked back down the aisle, passengers reached out to shake his hand. Some apologized. Some simply said thank you. Even the little boy from earlier smiled up at him. "You're the boss," he asked with awe. Marcus chuckled. "I guess you could say that." The boy grinned. "My mom says good bosses are kind. You must be a great one." Marcus smiled, his eyes misty. "Your mom's a wise woman," he said softly, echoing his earlier words. When he finally sat down, Claire approached quietly. "That was beautiful, sir." She whispered. "You changed the mood of the entire flight." Marcus smiled. Sometimes all it takes is a little light in the dark. As the plane cruised onto the night sky, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The coldness that once lingered was gone, replaced by warmth, reflection, and quiet admiration. Margaret sat motionless in her seat, tears glistening in her eyes, not from humiliation now, but from realization. She had been given a rare chance to see herself, to learn, and to change. Marcus stared out the window once more. The stars outside shimmered like promises, and he felt a peace settle in his chest. He didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. The real victory was in knowing he had met hatred with grace and won. In the stillness of that moment, Marcus whispered to himself, "Grandma, you were right. Love always wins, quietly but completely." The engines hummed, the clouds parted, and the plane continued toward its destination, carrying not just passengers, but a powerful lesson about dignity, compassion, and the strength it takes to stay kind in a world that isn't. For a long while after Marcus returned to his seat, the cabin remained wrapped in a hush that felt almost sacred. The clinking of glasses stopped, the whispers faded, and even the air itself seemed to pause in reverence. The revelation still hung heavy in every heart. The calm, soft-spoken man who had been humiliated at boarding was not just another traveler. He was the owner of the airline they were flying on. Margaret sat motionless, her hands clenched on her lap, her mind swirling in disbelief and shame. The words he had spoken kept replaying in her head. "We shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with respect." Each repetition struck her like a quiet wave, eroding the walls of arrogance she had built around herself for years. She stared down at her manicured hands, suddenly aware of how empty they looked. The diamond ring that once sparkled with pride now seemed dull, meaningless. Her reflection in the small screen before her looked unfamiliar, a stranger wearing a mask of superiority. She could still feel the weight of the passengers' eyes. But for once, they weren't looking at her with admiration. They were looking with disappointment, with pity. Up in the air, thousands of feet above the earth, Margaret Whitmore felt small for the very first time. Meanwhile, Marcus sat quietly in his seat near the back of first class, his expression peaceful. He wasn't thinking about revenge or victory. His heart was too gentle for that. What he felt instead was a strange sadness, a sorrow that people still needed titles to recognize worth. He hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson today. Life, it seemed, had simply chosen this moment to remind everyone that kindness was the highest form of strength. Claire, the flight attendant, approached him with a smile that trembled between pride and emotion. "Mr. King," she whispered softly, "I've worked in the skies for 10 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. You could have embarrassed her, but instead you made her and all of us think." Marcus turned to her, his eyes kind. "There's no use in shaming people, Claire. When someone's heart is closed, anger only locks the door tighter. But sometimes grace can open it just enough for the light to slip in." Her throat tightened. "You really believe people can change?" He smiled faintly. "I have to. My grandmother used to say, you can't heal a wound by cutting deeper. You heal it by showing what love feels like." Claire nodded, her eyes glistening. She quietly walked away, carrying the warmth of his words with her. A few minutes later, Margaret stood up, her knees unsteady. She hesitated, then began walking down the aisle, her steps slow and uncertain. The entire cabin seemed to watch her in silence. Her heart pounded so loudly she could almost hear it echo in her ears. She stopped beside Marcus's seat, her voice trembling. "Mr. King." He looked up, calm and patient, his face still carrying that same unshakable gentleness. "I wanted to say," she paused, swallowing hard, "I wanted to say I'm sorry. Deeply sorry. What I said earlier was cruel, ignorant, and shameful. I judged you without knowing anything about you. Her voice cracked, and tears brimmed her eyes. "I was wrong." Marcus studied her for a long moment. He could see how much courage it had taken her to stand there, exposed before everyone. He could see the sincerity fighting through her shame. Then, slowly, he stood up. "Apology accepted," he said softly. Her breath caught. "Just like that? After what I said?" He smiled faintly. "I don't forgive you because you deserve it. I forgive you because I deserve peace. Holding anger only keeps both of us chained to a moment that's already gone." Margaret's eyes overflowed. She covered her mouth as her shoulders trembled. "You're a better person than I could ever be," she whispered. "No," Marcus said gently. "I've just been broken before, and I learned that bitterness never built anything worth keeping." There was a silence so thick it carried more weight than applause ever could. A few passengers dabbed their eyes. Claire turned away, pretending to rearrange napkins, though her tears had already escaped. Margaret took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. "Mr. King," she said quietly, "when this flight lands, I want to do something. I don't know what yet, but I want to learn. I want to understand people better than I have. I can't change what I did, but maybe I can change who I become." Marcus smiled softly, and for the first time since the incident began, his smile reached his eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for." She nodded, tears still slipping down her cheeks, and returned to her seat. For the rest of the flight, she didn't speak to anyone. She just stared out the window, watching the stars shimmer against the black velvet sky. They looked different to her now, brighter, closer, like distant pieces of forgiveness shining in the dark. Marcus leaned back and closed his eyes, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His grandmother's voice came to him again, tender as a lullaby. "You'll never lose by being kind, baby. Even when it feels like the world is stepping on your worth. Stand taller. God sees," he whispered softly under his breath. "You were right again, Grandma." As the plane began its descent, the city lights below twinkled like scattered jewels. The intercom crackled to life as the pilot announced their arrival. Passengers began to stir, fastening seatbelts, collecting their belongings. But this time, something was different. The air felt lighter. The passengers glanced at Marcus with smiles, nods of quiet respect. When the plane finally touched down, a soft round of applause broke out. Not for the landing, but for the journey that had taken place in the hearts of everyone on board. Margaret waited as others disembarked. When her turn came, She stopped once more beside Marcus. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling, "for not treating me the way I treated you." He nodded, his gaze kind. "Travel safe, Margaret." She walked away, her head bowed, not in shame this time, but in reflection. For the first time in years, she felt truly human. When Marcus finally stepped off the plane, the cool night air met his face. He stood for a moment, breathing it in deeply. The terminal lights shimmered through glass, and somewhere inside him he felt the ache of history, of every injustice, every unspoken slight, every quiet battle fought by those who looked like him. But tonight wasn't about pain. Tonight was about peace. As he walked through the terminal, a young janitor, a black man not much older than his son would have been, recognized him. "Mr. King?" he asked, his eyes wide with admiration. "You're the Marcus King?" "Sir, your story changed my life. I'm saving up to start my own business someday. Seeing someone like you make it gives me hope." Marcus smiled, placing a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then promise me this," he said softly. "When you make it, lift someone else up, too. That's how we build something that lasts." The young man nodded, eyes shining. "I promise." Marcus walked away into the night, his footsteps quiet, his heart steady. The world outside was vast and uncertain, but he carried with him something indestructible. The knowledge that grace, even when met with cruelty, always leaves a mark deeper than hate ever could. High above the runway, the plane that it carried began its next flight, a symbol soaring through the dark sky, its wings glinting with the light of forgiveness, its path illuminated by the strength of a man who chose dignity over anger, compassion over revenge. And somewhere miles away, a woman named Margaret sat in silence in her car, staring at the night sky, whispering a prayer of gratitude for the stranger who had shown her what humanity truly meant. The sun had already begun to rise when Marcus King stepped out of the terminal. The early morning light stretched across the sky in streaks of pink and gold, painting everything it touched with a soft promise of renewal. The world outside was waking up, unaware that something extraordinary had happened on Flight 227, a story that would soon ripple far beyond that single journey. Marcus stood still for a moment, breathing in the cool air. The city smelled of coffee, rain, and beginnings. He had always loved mornings like this, quiet, humble, full of hope. He smiled faintly as he thought about the flight, not with bitterness or pride, but with a calm acceptance of someone who had long learned to let life unfold at its own pace. Behind him, passengers trickled out one by one. Some nodded respectfully. Others whispered his name in awe. The world Marcus knew loved power. But what moved them wasn't the fact that he owned an airline. It was how he had handled injustice with grace. A few reporters who had caught wind of the event hurried toward him, microphones ready. "Mr. King, is it true that a woman took your seat and insulted you before realizing who you were?" One asked breathlessly. "How you feel about that?" Marcus stopped, the question hanging in the air. Cameras flashed. For a second, he thought of saying nothing at all. Then, with the same calmness that had disarmed everyone on that plane, he replied, "I don't feel angry. I feel grateful." The reporters looked confused. "Grateful?" "Yes," he said softly, his voice steady but full of meaning. "Because moments like that remind me how much work we still have to do. They remind me why kindness matters, especially when it isn't returned." His words, carried by microphones and cameras, spread faster than the morning light. Within hours, social media was filled with headlines. Black airline owner forgives passenger who insulted him. Marcus King's grace in the face of racism inspires millions. The story touched something deep in people. It wasn't about wealth or revenge. It was about dignity. It was about the quiet, unshakable power of compassion in a world that often chooses cruelty. By the next day, Marcus's open letter appeared online. He titled it "Grace in the Face of Hate." It began with simple words. "I don't want to shame anyone. I want to remind the world that humanity isn't about who sits in first class or who sits behind. It's about how we treat each other when no one's watching." The letter went viral. Thousands shared it. Then millions. People from all over the world wrote comments about times they'd been judged, or when they had judged others. Teachers read it aloud in classrooms. Pastors quoted it in sermons. CEOs pinned it to their office walls. One woman wrote, "I used to be like Margaret. This story broke something in me and built something better in its place." Even Margaret herself saw the letter. She read it over and over, tears falling silently onto the printed page. She had not expected forgiveness. She had certainly not expected grace. But there it was, offered freely by the man she had wronged. That night, she sat by her window, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of every assumption she'd ever made. Every time she'd walked through the world believing she was above others. She wrote a long letter of her own, not to the media, but to Marcus. "Mr. King, I don't expect you to respond. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that your kindness changed me. I have lived a life of comfort, but not of compassion. I have looked down on people who didn't deserve it. I don't know how to undo the past, but I promise to start with the present. Thank you for not seeing me as an enemy when I acted like one. You taught me that real strength doesn't need to prove itself. It just is." Marcus received the letter a week later. He read it quietly, a soft smile touching his lips. He didn't reply. Some lessons didn't need words. The silence itself was enough, because forgiveness had already spoken. In the months that followed, invitations poured in. Universities wanted him to speak about leadership. News anchors wanted interviews. Activists wanted him at conferences. Yet Marcus never turned his story into a spectacle. He said the same thing every time. It wasn't a grand act. It was just a choice to be kind when it was hardest. One day, at a youth event, a young black student stood up during the Q&A. His voice shook as he said, "Mr. King, how do you keep believing in kindness when the world keeps being cruel?" Marcus paused for a moment, then answered, "Because kindness isn't about them. It's about you. Every time you choose kindness over anger, you win. Even if the world doesn't change, you do." The room erupted in applause, but Marcus's eyes were misty. He thought of his grandmother again, the woman who had seen in him what the world once refused to see. He imagined her smiling somewhere beyond the stars, whispering, "That's my boy." Years later, the story of Flight 227 became part of leadership courses and motivational talks around the world. People called it the Flight of Grace. It was no longer about one man and one woman. It had become a mirror showing humanity its reflection, the ugly and the beautiful alike. Margaret, true to her promise, changed her life. She began volunteering at community centers, mentoring underprivileged youth, and speaking about prejudice. She never mentioned Marcus's name publicly, out of respect for his privacy, but those who heard her speak often saw tears in her eyes when she said, "One day, a stranger's kindness saved me from myself." As for Marcus, he continued to run sky-high airlines with quiet brilliance. He launched scholarships for aspiring black pilots and created diversity programs that opened doors for those who had long been shut out. But through all the success, he remained the same, humble, compassionate, grounded. Sometimes, when he flew alone, he would sit in the very same seat, 3A, not as a symbol of ownership, but as a reminder. He would look out the window and whisper, "This seat isn't power, it's responsibility." One evening, as his plane soared through a golden sunset, Claire, now promoted to senior flight officer, walked past and smiled. "Still sitting in 3A, Mr. King?" He chuckled, "Just visiting old memories." She smiled knowingly. "That day changed all of us, sir." He nodded. "It did. And maybe that's why it had to happen." Outside, the sky blazed with orange and pink light. Marcus watched as the horizon stretched endlessly before him, wide and forgiving. He thought about the passengers from that day, the frightened boy, the weary mother, the quiet businessman, and of course, Margaret. Every one of them had carried that story into their own lives, and through them, it had multiplied like light reflected in countless mirrors. Marcus closed his eyes and whispered softly to himself, "Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it changes the future." When the plane landed, he stayed behind for a while as everyone else left. The cabin was empty, bathed in the last traces of twilight. He stood in the aisle, running his hand along the smooth leather of the seats. Each one, he thought, held a story, a laugh, a fear, a secret, a dream, and maybe, just maybe, a little more humanity now than before. As he stepped off the plane, a janitor nodded respectfully. "Good night, Mr. King." Marcus smiled. "Good night, and keep shining." The man grinned. "Try my best, sir." Outside, the runway lights shimmered like stars that had fallen to the earth. The wind carried the faint hum of another jet taking off. Another journey. Another set of souls learning, loving, failing, and forgiving. Marcus stood still for a long moment, watching it ascend. His heart was full, not with pride, but with peace. The quiet kind that only comes from knowing you've turned pain into purpose. He whispered one last time into the fading wind. "Thank you, Grandma. You were right. Love always wins." And with that, Marcus King walked into the dawn of a new day. Not as a man who owned an airline, but as a man who had learned and taught the world that the sky belongs to everyone,